The golden light of late afternoon slanted into the den entrance, cutting through the gloom to strike the packed earth floor. It cast long, stark shadows that stretched toward the back of the chamber, where the air hung heavy and still. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, the only movement in a space that had suddenly turned cold. Outside, the forest sounds had not died away, but they felt distant, muffled by the thick stone walls of the burrow. Inside, the family had gathered in a tight, uneven circle. No one shifted, no one groomed. The silence was not empty. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the floor and against the walls. Every set of eyes remained fixed on the center of the den, where the light faded into a deep, bruised purple. Each member of the family held their breath, waiting for the first word to break the tension. Mama Flora sat at the absolute center of the circle, her posture rigid and unyielding. She did not look at the walls or the entrance. Her gaze remained fixed on the space between her paws. She remained perfectly still, a statue of patience that forced the others to measure their own breathing against hers. The silence in the den deepened, becoming a tangible barrier between the family members. She shifted her weight, the sound of her paws scraping against the dry earth echoing like a crack in the stillness. Every head turned slightly, tracking her movement with desperate focus. She did not speak, but her presence commanded the room. She looked up, her eyes scanning the faces of her kin, acknowledging the fear and the exhaustion etched into their expressions. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, and the entire den seemed to lean forward, caught in the wake of her impending decision. Outside, the final rustle of dry leaves against the den entrance vanished, swallowed by the encroaching twilight. The last whisper of wind died, leaving the forest in a state of unnatural, hollow stillness. Inside, the effect was immediate. Every pair of eyes in the family snapped toward Mama Flora, locking onto her with intensity that bordered on desperation. The communal anxiety spiked, visible in the way ears twitched and shoulders tightened in unison. No one dared to blink. The air felt heavy, saturated with the unspoken questions that had plagued them for weeks. A ripple of movement passed through the circle. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a physical force, binding them together in a shared, suffocating dread. Mama Flora held their collective gaze, her eyes moving slowly from one face to the next, acknowledging the silent plea for guidance. The tension in the den reached a sharp, jagged peak. Every heart hammered against ribs, a rhythmic pulse that underscored the fragility of their sanctuary. The silence within the den did not break, but it changed. It became electric, a static charge that made the fur along their spines stand on end. The air grew thin, difficult to pull into their lungs, as if the space itself was shrinking under the pressure of the unknown. Every breath taken by the family sounded ragged and loud against the stone walls. Whiskers twitched involuntarily, sensing the invisible currents of danger. The walls of their home, once a source of comfort, now felt like a cage. They were no longer just waiting for a decision, they were waiting for an impact. The ground beneath their paws vibrated with a faint, rhythmic tremor that defied explanation. It was a pressure that pushed against their chests, a physical weight that made every muscle ache with the need for release. Ember pressed her paws deeper into the dirt, trying to ground herself, but the earth felt cold and unresponsive. The shadows in the corners of the den seemed to stretch and pulse, mimicking the erratic beating of their own hearts. The threat was no longer a distant rumor. It was a presence, pressing against the very threshold of their sanctuary, demanding a response. The heavy stillness finally snapped. Ash moved. He did not rise with the frantic energy of a panicked animal, but with a slow, grinding deliberation that drew every eye in the den to his feet. He pushed his weight onto his forelimbs, his muscles bunching under his skin as he hauled himself upright. He stood tall, his posture rigid, casting a long, jagged shadow against the den wall that seemed to dwarf the others. He took a single step forward, his claws clicking sharply against the packed earth floor. The sound was like a hammer strike in the quiet room. He did not look at Mama Flora. He did not look at the dark entrance. He paced a tight, measured circle in the center of the den, his head held high, his gaze fixed on the space just above the heads of his family. Each movement was calculated, precise, and devoid of hesitation. He stopped, planted his paws firmly, and turned to face the group. The silence remained, but it was sharp, expectant, and ready to be shattered by his voice. Ash opened his mouth, the sound of his voice cutting through the remaining tension like a blade. He did not waste time with pleasantries or soft warnings. His gaze remained locked on the center of the circle as he spoke. "The paw prints are no longer just on the perimeter," he stated, his voice low and steady, vibrating with a cold clarity. He took a step toward the center, his claws leaving deep, rhythmic gouges in the packed earth. "They are at the brook. They are at the edge of the clearing." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A collective shiver rippled through the family. The brook was the lifeblood of their territory, now tainted by the presence of an unknown intruder. The distance between the threat and their den had vanished. Ash paced again, his movements tight and controlled, his eyes scanning the faces of his kin. He saw the shift in their posture, the way their ears flattened and their muscles coiled in response to the news. The danger was no longer a shadow in the woods. It was a physical encroachment on their most vital resources. The reality of the situation settled into the den, turning the air brittle and sharp. Ash did not stop moving. He paced the perimeter of the den, his steps rhythmic and heavy, emphasizing the point he was about to drive home. He stopped abruptly, his body angled toward the dark tunnel that led outside. "If we wait for a direct confrontation, we lose the luxury of choice," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intense register. He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes hard and unblinking. "Right now, we can still leave on our own terms. We can pick the path, the time, and the destination." He swiped a paw across the dirt, erasing a mark he had made earlier. "But if we wait until the intruder is at our threshold, the choice is made for us. We will be flushed out like prey, running blindly into the dark with no plan and no safety." The weight of his logic settled over the group, stifling the air. He stood still, his muscles coiled, waiting for the impact of his words to take hold. The family remained silent, the gravity of the situation pressing down on them. Ash watched them, his breath hitching in his chest, waiting for someone to challenge the reality he had laid bare. The silence in the den stretched thin, vibrating with the sudden, cold reality of Ash's words. Ember felt a sharp, physical pang in her chest, a sudden constriction that made her breath hitch. She turned away from the center of the circle, her gaze drifting toward the rough stone walls of the den. Her eyes traced the grooves and jagged lines carved into the rock face. These were not just marks. They were a record of years spent surviving together. She reached out, her pads brushing against the cold, uneven surface of a scratch she remembered making seasons ago. Beside it were the deeper, wider gouges from Papa Finn and the smaller, frantic marks from Bree's early years. Every indentation held a memory of a winter storm weathered, or a season of plenty shared. She looked down at the pile of dried moss in the corner, the communal bed where they had huddled for warmth through countless nights. The scent of the earth and the familiar, musky smell of her family clung to the moss, a sensory anchor to everything they had built. She pressed her palm hard against the wall, feeling the grit of the stone beneath her claws. The thought of abandoning this space, of leaving these marks behind to be reclaimed by the damp earth and the encroaching forest, sent a tremor through her frame. She stood frozen, her fingers lingering on the stone, unwilling to accept that this history could be discarded in a single night. Ember pulled her hand away from the stone as if the wall had suddenly turned freezing. She turned, her movements sharp, and stepped back into the center of the circle to face Ash. The air between them felt thick, vibrating with the tension of her refusal. "We leave. We lose our history," she said, her voice rising to cut through the heavy silence. She gestured toward the walls, then toward the dark tunnel leading outside. "We become wanderers in a forest that is already closing in on us. We will be ghosts, moving through trees that do not know us, searching for a home that no longer exists." She paced a tight, defiant line in the dirt, her eyes locked on Ash. "If we walk away, we are not just leaving a den. We are abandoning the only proof that we ever stood together against the cold. Once we step out there, we are nothing but prey, drifting through the shadows until the forest finally claims us." She stopped, her chest heaving, her gaze sweeping across the rest of the family. She was not just arguing for a pile of moss or a stone wall. She was fighting for their identity. She stood her ground, waiting for the weight of her words to settle, refusing to let the fear of an unseen intruder dictate the end of their story. The air in the den remained brittle, charged with the friction of the argument. Ember stood rigid, her claws digging into the packed earth, while Ash remained braced, his muscles coiled for a rebuttal. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a physical barrier. Then, a slow, rhythmic sound broke the tension. Papa Finn shifted from the shadows near the back of the den. He did not rush, but his presence seemed to pull the oxygen back into the room. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his eyes shifting between his two children. He reached the center of the circle, where the dirt was churned from their pacing. With a steady, calculated motion, he lowered his front limb. His heavy paw landed firmly on the ground, squarely between Ember and Ash. The impact sent a dull thud through the floor, a sound that cut through the sharp edge of their voices. He held his position, his weight pressed into the earth, forcing the space between the siblings to widen. He did not look at them yet. He simply stood there, a massive, immovable anchor in the center of their fray, effectively severing the line of their confrontation. Papa Finn kept his paw pressed to the dirt, his gaze fixed on the dark, jagged opening of the den. He did not look at his children, yet his presence commanded the room. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, rhythmic rustle of wind. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. "My father once told me that fear is a poor navigator," he said, his tone devoid of judgment but heavy with experience. He shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the encroaching gloom. He believed that the shadows we fear are often just creatures as desperate as we are. He paused, letting the words hang in the thin, cool air. The family watched him, the tension in their shoulders slackening slightly as they processed the shift in his logic. He was not dismissing their danger, but he was stripping away the certainty of their panic. He looked back at them, his expression unreadable. "We have been running from ghosts of our own making," he added. "Perhaps it is time we stopped looking at the dark." The silence that followed Papa Finn's words was heavy, thick with the weight of his perspective. Mama Flora remained still, her gaze lowered, while Ash shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward the den entrance as if expecting a challenge to appear. Then, the stillness shattered. Bree, who had been huddled near the back wall, stood up with a sudden, violent jerk. Her movement was so sharp it startled the others, causing them to flinch. She took a single, aggressive step toward the center of the circle, her posture rigid. Along her spine, the fur stood up in a jagged, dark line, bristling with an intensity that seemed to vibrate in the confined space. She did not wait for an invitation to speak. Her eyes scanned the faces of her family, lingering on each one with a sharp, accusatory glare. "We are acting like cowards," she exclaimed, her voice thin and high, bouncing sharply off the stone walls of the den. She paced a short, frantic line, her claws clicking against the hard-packed earth. "We sit here. We debate. We hide," she spat out, her chest heaving. Bree did not stop moving. She circled the center of the den, her claws digging into the dirt with every step. She stopped suddenly, pointing a paw toward the entrance as if the forest itself were listening. "Look at the facts," she demanded, her voice dropping from a shout to a sharp, biting cadence. "We have seen no teeth, no claws, no violence, not once." She swept her gaze across the circle, forcing them to meet her eyes. "Only missing food. That is all we have to show for our terror." She took a breath, her chest heaving, and lowered her stance. What if it is just a starving animal? Something lost, terrified, and desperate for a scrap of warmth. She looked at Papa Finn, her expression hardening. "If we run now, we are no better than the things that hunt us. We are assuming malice where there is only hunger." She stood her ground, waiting for a response, her tail lashing back and forth. The air in the den felt colder now, the silence returning with a sharper edge than before. She had stripped away their excuses, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable possibility. Her final words hung in the stagnant air, vibrating against the stone walls long after she had fallen silent. The sound did not just fade, it seemed to settle into the crevices of the den, a persistent reminder of the accusation she had leveled. Bree stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts, her eyes still locked on Papa Finn. The family sat motionless, trapped in the wake of her outburst. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with the weight of her claim. Ash looked down at his paws, his ears flattening against his skull as he processed the possibility that their caution was merely a mask for deep-seated prejudice. Mama Flora shifted her weight, the dry earth crunching beneath her, but she did not offer a rebuttal. She stared at the dark entrance, her jaw set tight. The implication was clear. They had been running from a ghost of their own making. Every member of the circle avoided the gaze of the others. The shame was tangible, a cold pressure that made the den feel smaller. They were forced to look at their own fear, stripped of its justification. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, filling the space where words had just been. It was an absolute stillness that demanded acknowledgement. No one dared to break it, as if even a single intake of breath might shatter the fragile, uncomfortable reality Bree had forced into the open. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic drip of water from a crevice deep within the den walls. Each member of the family remained locked in their own posture, caught in the gravity of the moment. Ash kept his gaze fixed on the dirt floor, his claws tracing aimless patterns in the dust, while his breathing remained shallow and uneven. Mama Flora remained perfectly still, her eyes reflecting the dim light, yet her ears twitched at the slightest rustle of wind from the entrance. The weight of their predicament pressed down on them, a physical burden that made the ceiling seem to lower with every passing second. The air grew stale, heavy with the scent of damp earth and unspoken tension, as they sat together in the dark, forced to confront the crushing reality of their indecision. Ember finally lifted her head, her eyes scanning the circle. She stopped looking at the shadows and started looking at them. The silence had not just settled, it had left marks. She watched Ash. His shoulders were hunched, locked in a permanent, rigid knot, his muscles twitching with every muffled sound from the forest outside. He was vibrating with a need to act, yet he remained pinned to the spot by his own hesitation. Then she turned to Mama Flora. The weariness was no longer hidden. It was etched into the deep, tired lines around her eyes, a map of countless nights spent guarding the entrance against threats that never materialized. Flora's breathing was slow, heavy, and lacked its usual steady rhythm. Ember looked for a sign of relief, a moment of softness, but found only exhaustion. The family was fracturing. Every twitch of a tail, every shift of a paw confirmed the same truth. They were all suffering under the weight of their own private burdens. She saw the way Papa Finn stared at the ground, his focus entirely internal, and how Bree remained braced for a fight that might never come. They were together in the den, but they were miles apart in their thoughts. The realization hit Ember with the force of a physical blow. She saw it clearly now. They were not just waiting for an external threat. They were being dismantled from within by the very perspectives they clung to for safety. Ash was trapped by his need for control, his mind constantly calculating survival scenarios that left no room for patience. Mama Flora was anchored by the weight of past losses, her caution hardening into a wall that blocked any forward motion. Even Bree, in her desperate search for honor, was locked into a rigid demand for conflict that ignored the reality of their hunger. Each of them was shouting into the dark, but no one was listening. The unity that had once defined them was fraying. Every second they spent in this stalemate, the distance between them grew, their individual fears feeding the collective paralysis. Ember watched the way they avoided each other's gaze. She understood then that if they did not break this cycle, they would simply cease to be a family. The air in the den seemed to thicken, pressing against her lungs. Ember felt the rhythm of her own heart, a rapid, insistent thrumming against her ribs that demanded release. It was no longer a matter of waiting for someone else to lead. The silence was a suffocating shroud, and she was the only one capable of tearing it away. She shifted her weight, her claws digging into the packed earth until the soil gave way under the pressure. Every muscle in her body coiled, tight and ready. She looked at the center of the circle, at the empty space where their unity used to dwell, and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer the master of her movements. She took a breath, drawing the scent of damp earth and stale air deep into her chest. She needed to move. She needed to speak. The hesitation that had held her captive for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a singular, burning focus. She pushed herself upright, her legs steadying beneath her, and felt the shift in the room. The others were still locked in their own private worlds, but the static in the air had changed. She was ready to break the deadlock. Ember rose. The movement was sharp, a sudden break in the stagnant stillness that had held them all in place. Her paws hit the floor with a deliberate, audible thud that echoed off the den walls. She did not wait for permission. She did not look for a nod of approval from Papa Finn or a sign of agreement from Mama Flora. She simply occupied the space. The effect was immediate. Ash stopped his pacing, his head snapping toward her with a look of sharp surprise. Bree, who had been staring at the ground in frustration, lifted her chin, her ears twitching as she tracked Ember's motion. Mama Flora shifted, her tail uncurling from her paws, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the center of the circle. The air in the den seemed to vibrate with the sudden shift in attention. Ember felt the weight of every gaze landing on her. She stood tall, her chest rising and falling with steady, controlled breaths. She let the silence stretch, letting the surprise settle. Ember did not rush. She held the silence until it felt heavy enough to touch. Then, she shifted her weight and lowered her body toward the center of the circle. Her front paws reached out, sinking into the packed earth. With a slow, deliberate motion, she dragged her claws through the dirt. The sound was sharp, a dry, rhythmic rasping that cut through the stillness of the den. She pulled back a layer of debris, pushing aside the loose grit and old dust. She worked in a wide, sweeping arc, clearing a patch of ground, until the dark, damp soil underneath was exposed. She smoothed the surface with her palm, pressing down firmly to ensure it was level. The contrast was stark. A clean, dark circle amidst the cluttered floor. She did not look up. She kept her focus entirely on the task, leaving a pristine, blank space at the very heart of their gathering. She sat back on her haunches and finally lifted her gaze. Ember spoke, her voice steady and cutting through. She tapped the center of the cleared earth with a single claw. "We offer." The word hung in the air, foreign and jarring. Ash shook his head, his ears flattening against his skull as if he had misheard her. "Offer?" he repeated, his voice rising in sharp, jagged disbelief. "We are talking about survival, not charity." Ember did not flinch. She kept her gaze locked on the empty patch of dirt, then shifted her eyes to Mama Flora. "We leave food at the eastern meadow, right where the deep wood begins," she continued, her tone gaining momentum. "We give them something to take, something to hold." A low murmur rippled through the family. Bree stood up, her fur bristling, her eyes wide with shock. "You want to feed the very thing that is stalking us?" she exclaimed. "That is not a strategy, Ember. That is an invitation to our own destruction." Mama Flora remained perfectly still, her tail wrapped tight, her eyes searching Ember's face for a sign of madness. Ember ignored the rising protest. She pressed her claw into the dirt, drawing a long, jagged line to represent the tree line of the eastern meadow. "We do this at the edge of the deep wood," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "The meadow is open enough for us to see, but close enough for them to reach." She tapped the center of the line, marking a specific spot. "We leave a portion of our stores there, every evening, just as the light begins to fail." She looked up, meeting Ash's skeptical stare. "We do this for 7 nights. Not one night more, not one night less." She stood and paced to the edge of the den, pointing a paw toward the high ground. "We watch from the ridge. We stay hidden, silent, and observant. We track every movement from the shadows above." She turned back to the group, her posture rigid. 7 nights of observation. Dumb. We gather the data we lack. We wait to see how they approach the offering. She dragged her paw across the dirt, erasing the lines she had drawn, leaving only the damp, dark soil. 7 nights to determine if we are facing a predator or a neighbor. Ember did not let the silence linger. She stepped back, her paws leaving damp prints on the stone floor. "The stakes are absolute," she said, her voice dropping to a low, resonant register. "We observe for 7 nights. If the food is taken with violence, if the meadow is torn apart, or the offering is met with aggression, we leave. We abandon the den and move deep into the mountains by dawn." She paused, letting the weight of that potential loss sink into the packed earth. "But," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the circle. If the food is taken with caution, if the intruder approaches with hesitation or respect, we have our answer. We stay. We negotiate. A sharp intake of breath came from the back of the den. Ash leaned forward, his claws scraping against the rock, his eyes darting between Ember and the dark opening of the cave. The family remained motionless. The idea of a binary choice, total displacement, or a dangerous truce had paralyzed them. Bree sat back on her haunches, her mouth slightly parted, the earlier defiance replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed realization. Papa Finn shifted his weight, his heavy paws pressing into the dirt. No one spoke. The air in the den felt heavy, thick with the sudden, terrifying clarity of their future. The silence in the den stretched thin, vibrating against the stone walls. Mama Flora did not shift her gaze. She remained at the center, her tail twitching in a slow, rhythmic arc that cut through the stagnant air. Her claws clicked against the packed earth as she adjusted her posture, a deliberate sound that drew every eye toward her. She narrowed her eyes, the pupils dilating in the dim light, and fixed her stare squarely on Ember. "You are suggesting we invite the unknown to our table," Flora said, her voice devoid of warmth, carrying the weight of years of caution. She stood up, her movements stiff, and circled the patch of dirt, where Ember had traced the plan. She stopped, pressing a paw down onto the damp soil, effectively smearing the lines Ember had drawn. Flora continued, her tone sharpening. "We have survived by keeping the perimeter secure, by keeping the unknown out." She leaned in, the distance between them closing until their breaths mingled in the cool air. "This is not a strategy, Ember. It is an invitation to disaster." Ember did not flinch. She held her ground, her gaze locked with Flora's. The air in the den seemed to drop in temperature, the silence becoming a physical weight that pressed against them all. "I am not inviting disaster," Ember said, her voice steady and devoid of hesitation. "I am inviting clarity." She stepped back, gesturing to the dark opening of the den where the forest waited. "We are already living in disaster. We are hungry, we are on edge, and we are waiting for a blow that may never come. We must find out if the unknown is a threat or a neighbor. If it is a threat, we fight. If it is a neighbor, we end this cycle of fear." Ash stopped his pacing, his ears swiveling toward her. Bree leaned forward, her eyes wide. Even Flora paused, her tail stilling, the skepticism in her expression wavering. The choice was about survival through truth. The den fell into a profound stillness. Every pair of eyes shifted toward Papa Finn, waiting for the final word that would dictate their next move. Finn did not look at the family. He turned slowly, his paws making no sound against the stone, and moved toward the jagged opening of the den. He stepped into the threshold, his body silhouetted against the encroaching dusk. Outside, the forest was shifting. The golden light of the late afternoon was bleeding away, replaced by a deep bruised purple that stretched across the canopy. He watched the shadows lengthen, reaching toward the den like grasping fingers. He stood there for a long moment, his chest expanding as he inhaled the scent. The risk was absolute. To place food in the meadow was to signal their presence, to invite the unknown to their doorstep. He felt the weight of that responsibility. He looked back over his shoulder, catching the gaze of each family member in turn. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that cut through the lingering doubt. "It is a risk," Finn said, "but it is a calculated one. We start tonight." He turned back to the forest, his posture set, ready to face whatever waited. The finality of the decision hung in the air, heavier than the stone walls surrounding them. Outside, the last sliver of warmth vanished from the sky, leaving the horizon a bruised, deep purple that seemed to swallow the trees whole. The forest was no longer a distant concern. It was a physical presence pressing against the den entrance. Darkness poured into the clearing, thick and absolute. Papa Finn remained at the threshold, his silhouette barely visible against the encroaching gloom. He did not move, but his ears flicked, tracking the sudden shift in the wind. The familiar sounds of the day, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds had died away, replaced by a silence that felt sharp and expectant. Inside, the family stirred. The tension that had defined their debate began to transform into a cold, focused readiness. Ash stood, his claws clicking softly against the packed earth. Ember shifted her weight, her eyes fixed on the dark patch of sky visible through the opening. They gathered near the entrance, a collective movement of shadows preparing to step into the night. The trial had begun. The order was given, and the den transformed. Movement replaced the stillness of the debate. Ash moved to the storage pile, his paws working quickly to gather the dried roots and berries they had set aside for the winter. He did not look up. His focus was entirely on the task. Ember moved to his side, helping to bundle the food in a thick layer of moss. Their movements were synchronized, practiced, and efficient. Mama Flora stood by the entrance, her head tilted, listening to the forest. The air was cold now, biting at their fur. Suddenly, a sharp, dry snap echoed from the direction of the brook. The entire family froze. Ash dropped the bundle. Every head turned toward the darkness. They waited, muscles coiled, breath held in their chests. The sound did not repeat. After a long, agonizing minute, the tension in the room shifted from fear to a grim, focused determination. They were committed now. Papa Finn stepped out into the night, followed by the rest. The forest greeted them with a wall of black. They reached the edge of the deep wood and placed the food on the flat stone. They retreated to the ridge, settling into the shadows to watch.